Hey everyone, it's Charlie here and welcome to this video on what scores you need to get into a selective school here in Victoria. And so if you're looking to get into one of the big four selective schools in Victoria, being Macrob, Melbourne High, Nossal or Suzanne Cory, then in this video we're going to break down exactly what the exam is that you'll actually have to sit to gain entrance into one of these schools, but then also most importantly what scores you'll actually need to gain admission into these schools. And so just quickly before we get started with the video, a bit about me. My name's Charlie. I graduated from Melbourne High back in 2015 with an ATAR just below 98 of 97.65. This is me here on the screen in year 11 actually at Melbourne High. And after graduating from Melbourne High, obviously my ATAR allowed me to study law at Monash. And since then I've been working in the education space for about 5 years, helping students succeed with various aptitude tests. And so these are the four big selective schools in Victoria. And I'm sure a lot of you already know a lot about these schools, but if you don't, essentially there's a few key reasons why everyone wants to study at them. One of the big ones is the median ATAR. So the median ATAR across these schools at Melbourne High and Macrob and Nossal, it's around 95, which typically ranks them in the top couple of schools in the state. And then Suzanne Cory, it's typically around 90, which is again really strong. One of the other big reasons is just the percentage of students who get a 99 ATAR score. For example, last year at Nossal, around 11% of students got 99 ATARs, and at Macrob, it was close to 15%. And essentially what this means is it means a very large chunk, around 10% of students at these schools is placing themselves in the top 1% of the state, which is obviously very impressive given that it's all from the one school, so many students getting these 99 ATARs. For me, a few of the other major benefits of being at these schools was, number one, obviously they're a lot more affordable than a lot of the other top schools. So if you look at these four schools here, they're all free. There's no cost associated with attending them compared to a lot of the other schools with similar median ATARs, or in a lot of cases, worse ATARs, are private schools that cost 20, 30 or 40,000 a year. So that's definitely one of the big things. Another thing is just like it opens up a lot of opportunities for you after year 12. For me, it allowed me to get into law. A lot of my friends, it allowed them to get into medicine or engineering or biomedicine or commerce. And so being at one of these schools, it does set you up really well for a very high ATAR. Because it's just the median at these schools. It's just what a lot of people are getting. So it really does force you to raise your standards to get one of those scores. But then it also does open up a huge amount of opportunities after year 12, which positions you really well for the future. And so the question then is, how does the select entry admissions process actually work in Victoria? And to gain admission into these four schools, so Melbourne High, Macrob, Nossal and Suzanne Cory, they actually only accept students from year 9. And so what this means is that if you want your child to start at one of these schools in year 9, they'll have to start preparing for the select entry exam early because they're going to be sitting it in year 8. So the exam is held in June or July every year in year 8 for your child. So if they're in year 8 this year, that means they're sitting the exam this year. If they're in year 8 next year, then they're going to be sitting the exam in year 8 next year. And so really the reason why it's so competitive is that more than 3,000 students apply every year. More recently, it's been getting closer to 4,000. And because there's only a very fixed number of places into these schools, so for example, Melbourne High and Macrob, they accept around 360 students into every year level, and Nossal and Suzanne Cory, it's less than that. There's actually only around a 30% success rate for gaining entry into these schools. And so that means for all about the about 3,000 to 4,000 students to get in, there's only around 1,000 spots left. So it's very competitive, obviously for the reasons that we talked about before. These schools have very high median ATARs, they're very affordable, and then they also set you up very well for after year 12. And the way it works is for most students, which is something that really surprises a lot of parents and a lot of students, the exam, the select entry exam, is actually the only factor that determines whether they get into these schools or not. School marks aren't considered, co-curricular isn't considered, volunteer experience isn't considered. For 85% of students, it's purely just their performance on this exam, which determines whether they get in or not. For a small fraction of students, 5%, it is considered via an entrance pathway called principal's discretion. And for around 10%, they open up consideration to equity considerations as well. But what we generally recommend for most students is just focus on doing well in the exam. That's definitely the fastest and the easiest and the most direct way of getting in. And it's the way that most students are going to be getting in, which is around 85%. And so given the exam is so important, you might be wondering, what is the exam? And is it similar to school subjects? Is it different to school subjects? What can you kind of expect from it? And probably the biggest thing about this exam is that it's quite different to school subjects. It's a written assessment. It's designed to test ability rather than achievement. and it includes a focus on higher order thinking skills. And as I mentioned before, this means it is quite different from things that your child's studying for at school. And so you kind of almost have to treat it like a separate subject, an extra subject that your child's studying for that will need its own dedicated preparation outside of what they're doing at school for their typical school subjects. As you can see here, it says the exam is designed to measure aptitude for problem solving, reasoning, critical thinking, comprehension, interpretation, and applying known concepts to situations. This means it really is focusing more on the ability side rather than the achievement. And so you really are going to have to treat it like an extra school subject that gets its own attention and its own effort towards preparing. This last thing here is something that was actually taken from the ATAR website. So ATAR is the corporation which creates this exam for all the students to sit for select entry admissions, and they actually say that these skills, the skills which are assessed on this exam, can be developed over time through exposure to a culture of learning, by being immersed in a variety of age-appropriate and engaging stimuli, and by being encouraged to think deeply and freely discuss their learning. And so as ATAR says on their website, this exam, it is something that your child can prepare for and they can improve on and they can learn to master, even though it is designed to test ability rather than achievement. And that means because of that, a lot of students do prepare for a significant amount of time. We've typically seen most serious students will prepare for around 9 months before the exam. And that's just because it is something which really can be mastered and learnt through dedicated practice, just like a subject at school. And so you might be wondering, what does the exam actually look like? The way it works is it runs for 3 hours and there's 5 different sections. 1 being reading, 1 being maths, 1 being verbal, 1 being quantitative, and 1 being writing. And as we mentioned before, because the focus of this exam is more on ability rather than achievement, each of these sections of the exam will require their own preparation, just like a school subject at school. And so the way it works is in order to gain entry into a selective school, your child must reach an acceptable standard across all 5 of these sections. So across reading, maths, verbal, quantitative, and writing, they need to reach a minimum standard. And students are actually ranked against their peers for each section of the exam. And the way it works is the top 11% of students for each section. So for example, for verbal, the top 11% of students will be given a superior. The top 23% of students will be given above average. The top 40% will be given a high average. Then the top 60% will be given an average. And in terms of what your child should be aiming for, what I'm going to do is quickly run through a few examples of students who have got in and what their scores look like, and then also a few just best practices if you want to give your child the best chance of success. And so if we look at here, what does success look like? This first student here got 2 superiors, which obviously means they were placed in the top 11%, which is very strong. They also then got 2 above averages, which again is very strong in the top 23%. And then they got 1 high average, which is a little bit lower, but because they did have 2 superiors being in the top 11%, 2 above average scores, they got away with having 1 which was slightly lower, and so they gained entry successfully. This student here, on the other hand, they actually had 3 superiors, 3 scores in the top 11%, which is obviously very good. They had 1 high average, which is a little bit lower, and then they had 1 average. And so this student, obviously because they got 3 superiors, that set themselves up very well. Typically you would want to try to have most of your scores in either superior or above average rather than anything lower, but because this student got 3 superiors, they got away with having a few a little bit lower. The final student here, they got 1 superior, they got 3 averages, which obviously means they're in the top 60%, which just isn't good enough to get into one of these schools, given that we know only around the top 30% of students get in. And so this student was unsuccessful. And so the scoring system is something which a lot of people find confusing and they find it difficult to understand. But the simplest thing to remember is that only around the top 30% of students get in. And so you need to really be looking to get a superior or an above average for every single section. What we generally recommend is to aim for 3 superiors to give yourself the best chance of success, and to aim to have no scores below above average for any section. So if you think about it, the ideal scorecard would be something like this. Of course, 5 superiors would be the dream situation, but if you could get 3 superiors being in the top 11% in sections where potentially you're a little bit stronger naturally, and then 2 scores above average where you're in the top 23%, this is going to best set you up for success. And it's definitely possible to get in with scores lower than this. As we saw with students here, you can have different combinations that can get you in. But generally, what we recommend for students that we work with is we recommend and we guide them towards 3 superiors at a minimum, and then no scores below above average. And if they can maintain, as they say that is required for students, an acceptable standard across all 5 sections by getting at least above average in every section and then having 2 or 3 superiors or even more, that's going to give them a very good chance of success. And so from here, how can you actually best help your child achieve these marks? Or if you're a student, how can you actually best achieve these marks? One option is just go at it alone. We'll be publishing free useful content on this YouTube channel in the coming weeks and months. So you're welcome to consume all this content. There'll be more videos like this. We'll be breaking down some of the different types of questions that you can expect to see on the exam and showing you some of the skills and strategies you'll need to actually answer these questions successfully. The second option is to look for some sort of external support, and you could get support with us. We do have a tutoring program that gives your child structure, accountability, and guidance, just like you'd receive for a school subject, to maximize their chance of success. Across our tutors, they've got a lot of experience. They've helped hundreds of students gain entry into selective schools, and we typically see success rates of more than 80%. On top of that, if your child doesn't successfully gain entry to a selective school in their first year, we'll offer you free tuition the next year to make sure they actually do. And so if you're interested in hearing more about our tutoring program, feel free to book in a call at the link below. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed this video and we wish you good luck for the rest of your child's preparation.